So here's an outline basically of what I want to do today. So first thing is I'm an ornithologist. So why in the world am I talking about fish? So I'll spend a few minutes talking about that. And that's a little bit of a personal history story, but it's also a bit of serendipity. I'll then spend a little bit of time just talking in general terms about Pacific salmon, Pacific salmonids, but especially just the things we call Pacific salmon. And then focus in on one of those, cutthroat trout in general. They are one of the Pacific salmon. One that I think a lot of people are not as familiar with. Folks are not as familiar with it, with the cutthroats, as they are with things like steelhead and Chinook salmon. Then we'll focus in even a little bit more on just one of them, the Lahontan cutthroats. It's, you know, there's been both a tragedy and a hopeful trajectory for that story. And then I'll end with what I think are some other reasons for optimism. Although things are still bad for a lot of our Pacific salmonids, I think there is reason for optimism for some of them. And I'll finish off with that and bring it full circle. So first of all, since I'm an ornithologist and mostly I've had lots of things to talk to you about birds, why in the world am I talking to you about fish today? And part of it is that was sort of serendipity. Basically, the day that I needed to send Barry a title and a talk title for this, and I sort of had something all ready to go, kind of on Evening Grosbeaks or something that that I'm interested in. My son happened to be on his way home from college for spring break, and he had stopped to fish Pyramid Lake with some friends from Truckee, and he sent me this picture of this fish that he had caught. This is about a 15-pound Lahontan cutthroat. That's not even a super big one. It's a good sized one, but he caught bigger fish that day. And I sort of decided I would take this as a sign that maybe I should indulge my interest in fish and this very cool story that's been unfolding about these particular fish to just talk to you about this. And I need to preface this by saying, I consider myself more of kind of an enthusiast about this topic than I am, you know, a real expert and scholar. There are other people like my friend Mike Miller here at UC Davis, who's a fish geneticist who knows a great deal about this, right down to the genetics of a bunch of the different varieties of these fish. But I think I can give you what hopefully you'll find to be an interesting and engaging story here today. And actually, I do have a history of interest in fish and specifically in cutthroat trout, but it also originates in part with my son Lyle, who sent me that picture of the Lahontan cutthroat. He's 19 years old now. He's a freshman in college, just finished his first year. And but really my strongest interest in cutthroat trout originated with taking him fishing. Here's a picture of him up in the High Sierra when he's 4, fishing near, this is in Dana Meadows on the Dana Fork, fishing for the little brown trout and brook trout and rainbow trout that are up there, all introduced. Almost all of our High Sierra fish, except in the Southern Sierra where there were golden trout, virtually all of the High Sierra watersheds and lake basins and stuff that have fish in them, it's because we introduced them. That's another very interesting story. I don't know if anybody's ever talked to you about interactions between fish and birds like rosy finches that both eat things like aquatic insects at different stages of their life cycles. That's another really interesting topic for a talk. But here's Lyle, and this is our first fishing adventure, you know, where we go off for a couple of weeks each summer and go fishing. And he's not fishing for cutthroat trout here, but it turned out my parents, his grandparents lived in Jackson, Wyoming. And here he is fishing for fine spotted Snake River cutthroat trout on the Snake River in Jackson Hole when he's probably about the same age as the other picture. Maybe, yeah, I think he's probably 4 years old in this picture too. So he got really interested in cutthroat trout. And later on, here's a picture of him fly fishing for sea-run coastal cutthroat trout up on the Queets River, which is one of the big glacial streams on the Olympic Peninsula. So his interest sort of really got focused in on cutthroat trout. And it turned out then there was a friend of mine who met him when he was pretty little still, a friend of mine from graduate school, who fished with him in Wyoming. And we subsequently got in the mail this book by Patrick Trotter. It's called Cutthroat, Native Trout of the West. And it is effectively a coffee table book, but it's also really a scholarly treatise. It's quite fascinating to read. It has an enormous amount of really neat biology in it and a ton of really extraordinary history of a bunch of the different varieties of cutthroat trout and conservation meetings that have happened and efforts on their behalf and so forth. So if anybody wants a long, engaging read, this is a really fascinating book. And a fair amount of the information that I'll give you today came out of it as well. So this is basically where my interest got piqued. This was like bedtime reading sometimes when Lyle was small, and we would read this book to put him to sleep, although his fascination with it, he often did. I would often fall asleep before he did, trying to read this to him. But it really piqued my interest in the enormous diversity of cutthroat trout, which I had not been that aware of, and the diversity of behavior and natural history. And we'll talk about those things a little bit today. So I'm going to start just with background about Pacific salmonids, their natural history, and some of the variation. And I'm just going to scratch the surface on this. And here's a figure, and I'll just say I've taken like just completely flagrantly stolen images from all over the web, and I'll try to give them credit, but I don't even know where a lot of them came from. But I just blanket thank the people who produced them. This one's a little weird because the two biggest species are the smallest on this poster. Chinook and chum salmon are by far the largest in physical size, but they're showing up as the littlest here. Most of you have probably heard of a lot of these different Pacific salmon. Chinook, also called king salmon, chum salmon, which have been called dog salmon because people use them a lot to feed sled dog teams in Alaska and Canada. Coho salmon are also called silver salmon. Sockeye are the proverbial redfish. And then pinks are often called humpies because of this really pronounced humped back that they develop when they're breeding. And then steelhead. Many of these actually used to be kept in different genera. They were in different genuses, but these are all now in this genus Oncorhynchus, which means hooked jaw. And steelhead are very famous. They're essentially a sea-run rainbow trout. And then cutthroat trout. These are all of our Pacific salmon. There are some other salmonids like bull trout and Dolly Varden, which are pretty similar things, but they're a char. They're not a salmon, but they also share a lot of the characteristics of these fish. Some interesting life history variation that these have. There's that it's going to be relevant. There's some that are what we call fully anadromous. These are migratory fish, and all of the species that I showed you on the previous slide have some of them that are fully anadromous. This means that they spawn in fresh water, but then the young fish at some point in their life migrate down to the ocean and then grow to maturity in the ocean before returning to fresh water. Some of them actually return to fresh water before they become fully mature. So there's these weird, interesting variants. But in general, the basic cycle is grow up in the ocean, migrate to fresh water, and spawn. And then in some cases, like many of the classic Pacific salmon, they just breed once and then die. Others, like cutthroat trout and steelhead, can do multiple back and forth migrations. So then some of these also have permanent freshwater resident forms. Some of the resident forms, the ones that live in fresh water all the time, do migrate but not to the ocean. And then some of them are just completely resident. So ones that you may have heard of include kokanee, which is a landlocked or freshwater only sockeye salmon. There are some individuals and some populations of rainbow trout that just stay in freshwater all the time. And some of those are migratory and some of them just are sedentary. And then some individuals and some populations of cutthroat trout. In fact, most of the subspecies of cutthroat trout that I'll just go through in a minute are exclusively in fresh water. Many of them do migrate, but not to the ocean. It's only the coastal form of the cutthroat trout that actually go into the ocean. There's these other two really interesting variants of the migratory biology, and there's one that we can call a premature migrant form. And they're called premature because they migrate from the ocean into the fresh water before they have become ready to reproduce. So these are known as spring Chinook salmon and summer steelhead. If you've heard of those are what are called premature migrants. They migrate to freshwater early in the season, in the spring or the summer. The exact months that they do it vary quite a bit depending on where they are in the latitude of the range and this kind of thing. But they're generally given these names, spring Chinook and summer steelhead. And like I said, they come into the rivers from the ocean when they're reproductively immature. So the gonads are not ready to reproduce at all. And actually they have huge deposits of lipids, of fat in their body tissues, which actually makes them particularly attractive for food. And spring Chinook are noted for being one of the best eating of the salmon. They use all that lipid that they have to sit and wait for weeks to months in the creeks and rivers until conditions become conducive for them to move even further up into the highest tributaries. So many of the longest distance migrants, summer steelhead, for example, that move all the way up into interior Idaho, and Chinook that do the same kind of thing, and way in the interior of Oregon, going up the Columbia and then the Snake, and then up things like the Grand Ronde River and the Deschutes. These are fish that are these premature migrants, and then they wait a long time in the fresh water before moving up to the very highest tributaries to spawn. The other group is what we call mature migrants. This is fall Chinook and winter steelhead, and a bunch like coho do this, and chum salmon and pink salmon are all fall mature migrant fish. And what they do is they migrate to freshwater late in the season, and they come in basically ready to breed. So the gonads are developing or are already mature, and then they spawn almost right away down in the main stem rivers and streams. They don't go nearly as far upstream as the premature migrants. So these are two really distinct forms of these kinds of fish. And some of them, like chum salmon and pink salmon, they tend to spawn very close to the saltwater. And the babies, when they hatch, go right into the saltwater almost immediately. So I'm not going to say much more about that, but the Chinook and steelhead and some of the others, the baby fish stay in the river for an extended period of time in the freshwater before they move down into the saltwater. But some, like the chum and the pink salmon, go straight in. So dams and the impoundments behind them have been particularly harmful to the early migrant forms and the ones that move really far inland, because they block or at least dramatically impede the upstream migrations that these fish make. And they also interfere with the out migration of the little fish that are called smolts. These are the baby fish that are getting ready to live in salt water. And the dams and impoundments really mess that up, because those fish, like on the Columbia River, for example, those fish, the babies, the smolts, normally would have been blasted out to the fresh water or to the salt water, to the ocean by the big freshet of spring runoff, and that gets blocked and slowed down by all these dams on the Snake and the Columbia, and it really messes these fish up very dramatically. The dams also give predators the opportunity to catch these things that would normally have been blowing by really quickly. In California, most of our wild runs of fish are now either extinct or are just sort of meager vestiges of the historical runs. It's really been a tragedy. Most of the runs now there's lots of salmon and steelhead around in different ones of the rivers, but they're almost all maintained by hatcheries. I might go so far as to say they pretty much all are, especially if there's fish. Anyway, it's really been quite a tragedy. And just for example, the fall Chinook runs are maintained by a number of hatcheries that are on several of our Central Valley rivers. All these different rivers over here, I don't know if you can read them all, but all of them except the Cosumnes, as far as I'm concerned, as far as I know, as far as I'm aware, have impoundments on them that impede and interfere with migrations, and particularly cut off access of the premature migrant fish to the very upper reaches of the watersheds where they would normally have gone to spawn. Okay, so that's some just general natural history of the Pacific salmon. Let's focus in on one of these Pacific salmon fish, the cutthroat trout, which Patrick Trotter in his book, he calls that the native trout of the West. Of course, steelhead also are native trout of the West, but the cutthroat are distributed all through all these different habitats, and they occupy some extraordinary places, including very much desert country. It's quite extraordinary. So we'll talk for a few minutes now about cutthroats in general. They've been named for these spectacular cutthroat slashes that you can see on this fish. This is a coastal cutthroat. But these cutthroat slashes are on the lower part of the jaw, and they use them in various kinds of displays when they're engaging in behavioral interactions with other trout. These fish have had other names. They're also called fine spotted trout or speckled trout. They've sometimes been called salmon trout. Especially the Lahontan cutthroats were called salmon trout because they got so big. Right, but they were they're not the most spectacular. Most of these are not anywhere near as big, and they're easily overlooked. In fact, you can see old pictures of stringers of what they call half-pounder steelhead from the Rogue River in Oregon that have some cutthroats in there, and people just didn't even know that's what they were. They just thought it was another little half-pounder steelhead. But especially if they've gone into the ocean, this can be quite pale. So you have to use other characteristics like the jaw structure and other things to be sure you have a cutthroat trout. There are variants, life history variants and behavioral variants of the cutthroat trout, as well as of all those other salmon in the group. There's totally stream resident forms. They carry out their entire life in small streams. So especially populations that live up very high and often above impassable barriers on the streams, like waterfalls and things like that got isolated historically up there. These will just carry out their entire lives up there. They don't grow very fast. They don't get very big, but they become reproductively mature, and they just have their entire life cycle in the streams. Then there's what are called fluvial cutthroat trout, and these are ones that spawn up in tributary streams, and then the young, after some number of years, migrate down to larger rivers where they grow to maturity before they move back up to spawn again. So that's fluvial. The big fish reside in the rivers and spawn in small streams. Adfluvial are ones, it's basically the same thing. They spawn in tributary streams, but the young ones migrate to lakes where they grow to maturity. So there's some of them that hang out in big rivers in between spawning runs. Those are the fluvial ones, and there's some that hang out in lakes between spawning runs, and that's the adfluvial. And then there's anadromous, and those would be the ones that spawn in streams, and then the young migrate to the ocean to grow. And we have all of those forms within cutthroat trout, with the caveat that the only ones that are anadromous are the coastal cutthroat subspecies. And we'll talk about the subspecies next. So there are at least 9 extant, that is currently living cutthroat trout subspecies. And just to make sure you know what this term means, a subspecies is just another, it's a name for a distinct geographic race. So it's a form that is distinct in some way, morphologically, genetically from other forms, and it has a particular geographic locale that is where it lives. And it's distinct from the geographic locales of others. They can overlap and sometimes may hybridize, but they're largely distinct. And there are 9 of them. There's 10 things shown here, but these 2 are just different forms of the coastal cutthroat. So there's the sea-run coastal cutthroat, Oncorhynchus clarkii. They're named for William Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition. This is the stream resident version of the coastal cutthroat. And then all the rest of these are exclusively in freshwater. If you consider places like Pyramid Lake freshwater, it's a very alkaline and somewhat salty lake, but it's still a freshwater lake. So there's Bonneville cutthroats, Paiute cutthroats, Colorado River cutthroats, Rio Grande cutthroats, Greenback cutthroats, West Slope cutthroats, Lahontan cutthroats, which we'll talk more about, and Yellowstone cutthroats. And some of these actually Lahontan cutthroats, for example, Patrick Trotter in his book, he argues that there's some of what is generally classified as Lahontan cutthroat that should be split off as a separate thing called a Humboldt cutthroat. Let's see, Yellowstone cutthroat many people include the fine spotted Snake River cutthroat in that group as well. So there's some other ones where people still argue about what they should be called. Here is just a range map of the Western United States and Southwest Canada that shows where these all live. So the coastal cutthroats are, as you can imagine from the name, they're along the coast. They extend down to the northernmost rivers, like the Smith and the Eel in northwestern California. And then they're in all the coastal streams going up Oregon and Washington, British Columbia, and into Southeast Alaska, which isn't shown on this particular map. Then the West Slope cutthroats are this brownish area here. There's several sort of disjunct populations of them, but these are essentially in lower Snake River and Columbia River tributary rivers. Yellowstone cutthroats, which includes the fine spotted Snake River cutthroats, include sort of upper Snake River and upper Yellowstone River watersheds. Then the Colorado River cutthroats are in the upper Green River and upper Colorado River watersheds. Greenback cutthroats are in the upper Arkansas River watersheds. Rio Grande is in the Rio Grande River watersheds. And then the ones that we're going to focus on here actually are over here. This is the Great Basin. All of these other ones are on watersheds that drain into some part of the ocean. Some of them drain into the Gulf of Mexico. Some of them drain into the Gulf of California. Some of them drain into the Pacific. And yeah, right. So this also goes into the Missouri. So the Yellowstone cutthroats go into the Missouri River drainage. So that's Gulf of Mexico as well. But these, which are the Lahontans and the Bonneville cutthroats, those go into the Great Basin. So the Bonnevilles are in the eastern Great Basin, so like the Wasatch Range and parts of southwest Wyoming, and extreme southern Idaho, southeastern Idaho. Then the Lahontans are in the western Great Basin, and then the Paiute, which is it's got the most limited range of any of the cutthroats, of any of the living cutthroats, is just in a few streams isolated above impassable barriers in the eastern Sierra Nevada, like Silver King Creek. And they're really just an almost spotless, literally Lahontan cutthroat is what the Paiutes are like. They're just little guys. but they don't have access to big places to feed like the Lahontans do. Okay, and then Humboldt cutthroats, if you believe in those, would be up here somewhere in the northern part of the Western Great Basin. So this all goes back to the Pleistocene. There was much more water in the Great Basin than lots of little lakes, as well as these two very big ones. In the eastern Great Basin in the Pleistocene, there was this big thing called Lake Bonneville, of which the Great Salt Lake is the little residuum. And Bonneville cutthroat trout evolved there and went up the various streams in a lot of the different parts of the Great Basin. And actually, they've reintroduced Bonneville cutthroat to some of the streams in Great Basin National Park, which is interesting. They're trying to get those things back into some of their native range, which is cool. And actually, my son Lyle has caught these in extreme southwestern Wyoming in Salt Creek, where they've lived all this time. In the Western Great Basin, we had Lake Lahontan, which is actually it's a very fingered kind of lake. The only lakes that remain of it really are Walker Lake and Pyramid Lake. So for example, Lake Winnemucca has dried up subsequently, but we still have these little tiny remnants of Lake Lahontan in which the Lahontan subspecies evolved. Okay, zeroing in a little bit closer now, we have where Lahontan cutthroat trouts are the biggest ones were and the largest populations was Pyramid Lake and Walker Lake. There also were some that were not lake dwelling. They were just the fluvial type living in the Carson River, is my understanding, is that they did not migrate to lakes because I don't think there were any. I believe these are impoundments down here. So Pyramid Lake and Walker Lake are fed by the Truckee River and the Walker River. And there historically were large runs also of Lahontans up both the Walker and the Truckee watersheds, huge runs of these things, a very large fish. They got up to 40 pounds and larger in the Pyramid Lake Truckee River system. And there were actually commercial fisheries for them. And the Paiute tribes, my understanding is that they were quite reliant on them in parts of where they lived until we obliterated them. There were thriving populations in the Carson River watershed, and there were even ones in the Susan River, which is up further to the north and west and goes into Honey Lake. But there have been a lot of challenges for Lahontan cutthroats. These include, and probably it's not even limited to these things, introduced fish species, competing with them, over harvesting, which was extreme, water diversions, grazing, especially by cattle, which damage especially small upstream stream banks and things like that, and damage the spawning grounds. Logging, which also leads to excessive erosion and runoff and siltation of spawning grounds. Water quality degradation through pollution, especially from mining, 100 more years ago. So there were all of these things happening. Some of them were particularly devastating, like water diversions, but it all, even before some of the worst water diversions happened, water quality problems and overharvesting and introduced fish species were taking their toll on these fish. So in Walker Lake, which by the way, if you drive along US 395, along the West Walker River, there is a there's a place you can stop, and it's one of, I can't remember if it's one of the campgrounds or just a day use area, right along that canyon just south of the town of Walker before you get to Bridgeport. And there's like a big informational kiosk with that describes the runs of Lahontan cutthroat that used to come up that river from Walker Lake, and they haven't for many decades. The numbers were in serious decline by 1911. And in 1949, there had been spawning runs, fish trying to come up and spawn in the river for years, but loss of water for agriculture and things like that had been problematic. And finally, I think it was the state game department just collected all of them, all of the spawners that came in 1949 that tried to come into the river to spawn. They just collected them all and used them as a brood stock to create a hatchery population, which is now how the lake population in Walker Lake is sustained, is my understanding. There's no natural spawning at all. The Carson River populations were all gone completely by 1966, according to Trotter's book. But it turns out, and this is one of these fortuitous things where we doing stupid things end up maybe coming back to have been fortuitous in the future, is that coffee can transplants, basically people kind of just informally moving fish around so that they could have fish in places that they wanted to go and fish that didn't have fish, actually preserved some of these apparently in some of the higher reaches of the Carson River drainage. The Pyramid Lake Lahontans, and this is what I'm going to focus on basically for the rest of the presentation here. Historically, there were these huge runs that I mentioned before that migrated up the Truckee River. Cutthroats are basically kind of spring spawners, so they would come up in the spring, and they would come up to tributaries of the Truckee as well as to Lake Tahoe and even above. Now, my understanding is that there also were ones that resided in Lake Tahoe and migrated up out of Lake Tahoe, but apparently some of the fish from Pyramid Lake would come all the way up to Lake Tahoe and then migrate even above Lake Tahoe. So it was sort of an interesting mixture of Tahoe and Pyramid Lake sort of populations that went up to these different spawning areas. And by the way, the conditions in Pyramid Lake are kind of unique. So it's turned out, it's this very alkaline lake, and it's turned out that Lahontan Cutthroat Trout actually do really well in a bunch of desert lakes in eastern Washington and Oregon that other fish have, that state fish and game departments have tried to, establish populations for people to fish for. And rainbow trout and other kinds of things like that have just failed completely in some of these lakes. And Lahontans have actually thrived, but the ones that have been planted in those lakes are not the ones that get super big, apparently. But they're well adapted to these highly alkaline, relatively salty lakes with very different kinds of water quality, water conditions. So these fish, these migratory fish, the Paiute tribes, they provided them to people, traded them to people who were exploring the country, back 200 years ago, or 100 years ago at least. And they provided commercial fisheries that fed miners and railroad workers, and they were also shipped to places like San Francisco for restaurants. They were grossly overexploited, and some of it's really tragic. Like some of the population, some of the runs that went up out of Lake Tahoe, they were harvested just to get the roe that they could use for people to fish with salmon eggs. So just this, grossly wasteful. And I mean, we were not theoretically aware of just how devastating what we were doing was, but we were very not thoughtful about this. And basically Patrick Trotter describes this as essentially mining these populations that were thriving and that we drove to either extinction or near extinction. So continuing with the Pyramid Lake thing, there were already declines in the populations by the early 1900s, but in 1905, the Derby Dam was completed. And my understanding is this was the very first project of something called the Newlands Project of the Bureau of Reclamation, which had started recently, and it was supposed to reclaim desert lands, especially by providing irrigation water. There's a fascinating book, Mark Reisner's book, Cadillac Desert, goes through a lot of this, and a lot of actually Wallace Stegner's historical writing, if any of you are familiar with him. it talks about some of these kinds of things as well, if you want to look into that. I'm not by any means super knowledgeable about all the history of this, but those are good sources to go to. But anyway, this was a diversion project where they blocked the Truckee River and diverted some water in a canal over to the Carson River watershed in order to provide better water availability for agriculture. And my understanding too, reading through Trotter's book, as well as some other things that I looked at, is that there have been multiple attempts actually to have some kind of provision for fish passage. Even this very first one, my understanding was that they attempted to have some fish passage. Wasn't that they completely ignored it, but it was like so many of those early attempts was just grossly ineffective and insufficient. And so the effect really was to essentially prevent, starting in 1905, any of these migratory fish from the fish coming up from Pyramid Lake from getting above Derby Dam, which is well out in Nevada. That's, I don't remember exactly where it is, but it's east of Reno Sparks. So the fish could not get anywhere near their normal spawning tributary streams well up the Truckee. So the fish continued to attempt these migrations up the river, and they're quite long-lived. And I guess maybe they must have been effectively spawning for a little while down below the Derby Dam in order for the population to remain for a while. But it was continuing to dwindle. And by 1943, the Pyramid Lake Lahontan Cutthroats were just declared extinct or extirpated. There were still Lahontan Cutthroats around in various other places like Summit Lake and up in some of the tributary streams in the Sierra Nevada, these little stream resident populations and things like that. But the big Pyramid Lake ones were just gone. So in the mid 1980s, ones from the Summit Lake population, which is in northwestern Nevada, were introduced to Pyramid Lake through a hatchery program, and they actually thrived there, and people could fish for them and everything. And they were pretty big as cutthroat trout. You know, most people are pretty excited by a 4 or 5 pound cutthroat trout. If you catch a 4 or 5 pound cutthroat trout in the Snake River in Wyoming, you've got a lunker. And those were pretty common in the Pyramid Lake population. But they don't grow as fast, these ones from Summit Lake. They don't have the growth potential, and they were not as long-lived. A lot of the huge size of these ones that had been there historically was because they just lived longer too. And these were maintained by a hatchery program that I understand was through the Paiute Indian tribe, Indian Nation. But as it turns out, back in 1977, there had been some exploration happening in this Pilot Peak area, which is almost in Utah. It's extreme eastern Nevada. It's in the Bonneville Basin, actually, and some cutthroat trout were found in these tiny creeks up there, little populations of small, what appeared to be stream resident cutthroat trout. And theoretically, these should have been Bonneville cutthroats because of where they were, but it turns out a graduate student who was studying Bonneville cutthroat at the time examined the specimens that got collected and declared them to be Pyramid Lake Lahontans. And actually, he couldn't tell that they were Pyramid Lake fish specifically, but when people looked through all of the information about when any kind of stocking could have happened and whatnot, it had to have been prior to 1930, and all stocking that happened prior to 1930 was Pyramid Lake fish, apparently. So this had the potential to be a reservoir of the genetic strain that came from Pyramid Lake. Now, so just as an aside, you might think, well, but that's this big migratory form, and these are these little ones restricted to the streams. The degree of flexibility of these fish is really extraordinary. And when isolated in a particular habitat, they can grow slowly and just not get very big and carry out their life cycle within the stream. So I'll mention later that this same sort of thing, preservation of the genetic diversity that was needed for a particular behavioral and physiological capacity appears to have been preserved in rainbow trout that were isolated above the dams on the Elwha River in Washington too. So when the dams were taken out, fish started migrating again, and now there's summer steelhead back up in the upper Elwha that appear to have been derived from the ones that had formerly been isolated above these dams and couldn't migrate. So it's really fascinating and it's quite wonderful. But you would have thought that these Pilot Peak Lahontans would have gotten everybody really, really excited if they could have come from Pyramid Lake. But it actually was just years before anybody did anything about this. And back in the late 1990s and in the 2000s, the folks who were trying to get organized to really do a recovery project for the Pyramid Lake Lahontans decided to do the genetics on these things. And they worked out, got some serious gene jockey folks to sort out extracting DNA from old specimens, dead specimens from the Pyramid Lake population. Geneticists can get good DNA. DNA is a really durable molecule, actually. And they compared the Pilot Peak and the old Pyramid Lake fish, and the genetics were quite extraordinary in terms of how well they matched. So some new brood stock were created from these Pilot Peak fish, and it was fortuitous that they did it when they did, because my understanding was just a few years later, there was a fire that may have actually wiped out a lot of these very small stream populations on Pilot Peak. So if they had waited much longer, we might have missed this opportunity. In 2006, the Pilot Peak strain were reintroduced, I'm going to call it, to Pyramid Lake, and actually as little fingerlings. They were put in as fingerlings from the hatchery population that had been started from the samples from the fish collected from Pilot Peak. And within 4 years, fishermen were starting to catch these much bigger fish much more frequently. And this one, like I said, this is this 15-pound fish that my son caught. And that's not even that big of a one. I mean, he caught later that day another one that was over 20 pounds. And so this is really, really extraordinary. I mean, that is a big fish. That's like a steelhead, a big like Northwest steelhead. Yeah, so this is very exciting. And these fish actually have been starting to move up. Hundreds of them are trying to go up the Truckee River now and they've been getting as far as Derby Dam. And actually in 2020, there was the completion of part of this sort of resuscitation of the Pyramid Lake trout population project. Involved in the design and installation of what's called a horizontal fish screen, which I have to confess, I even looked at videos from the Bureau of Reclamation to try to understand how this worked, and I couldn't quite figure it out. But it was, what it's supposed to do is divert some of the water basically through a screen that the fish won't get diverted into. But that water is then sent into the canal to go for the agricultural purposes. But a head of water that's of a sufficient depth and velocity to keep the fish in it and safe from being, sent through the screen or plastered up against the screen allows fish. It's supposed to allow, my understanding is, both upstream passage of the big fish, the migrating big fish, to allow them to get back to tributaries upstream that have been denied to them since 1905, when the dam was originally completed. And it also, importantly, would allow the young fish, the out migrant ones, smolts, if you will, although they're going back to a lake rather than to the ocean, to come down this successfully and not get diverted off into agricultural water. They get to stay in the main river and hopefully make it back down to Pyramid Lake. So I don't actually know what the exact status of this is right now, but what I've heard from my son was talking about this when his friends who live in Truckee and have been paying attention to this were saying that, the hope is that this is basically going to reinstate a natural spawning run of Lahontan cutthroats of essentially the original Pyramid Lake genetic strain in the Truckee River and upstream tributaries. Now, of course, there's all sorts of weird impoundments and dams and junk on those upper tributaries. There's water quality problems on some of them and whatnot. So this is not like this is a panacea, but it's very exciting. And the hope is that this is going to succeed. And the other thing that, as I was reading about this, that I found very cool and exciting was that it was multiple different entities, agencies, and so forth. The Paiute tribe, the Bureau of Reclamation, who were originally responsible for blocking the fish runs back in 1905, put in a lot of money. There was engineering firms trying to figure out how to make this design that would work. There's a bunch of conservation organizations, river preservation organizations, and angling organizations and whatnot. And then farming communities trying to come to some kind of a reasonable consensus on how to do this in a way that meets, in a reasonable way, the needs of all the different stakeholders. So I just thought this was really exciting and cool. Other hopeful stories, just to leave on hopefully mostly an upper note. The Elwha River dams that I mentioned before have been taken out back in 2012. And the original 5-year moratorium on fishing in the Elwha was extended. So it's amazing. The Elwha is one of the longest rivers. If you look at a map, I should have put a map in it. It goes way up into the central Olympic Peninsula, into the central mountains. It's one of the glacial streams. It has a very long reach with lots of spawning habitat and little tributary streams. It had all of the original native Northwest salmonid and anadromous salmonids, I guess, except Arctic char. It had everything. It had bull trout, and it had all of the Pacific salmon, including cutthroat trout, summer steelhead, everything. And those are reappearing. Some of them have been reintroduced. This is another one of these things that's being done, between the state game departments and the local tribes up there. So this is another really exciting sort of thing to see happen. There's a very cool, if you search for a video, Trout Unlimited produced a video about the summer steelhead runs that have just reappeared up there, basically spontaneously. As in a recent year, there were more, they counted more summer steelhead up in the Elwha when they did snorkeling surveys than they did in all the other rivers on the peninsula that they surveyed combined. So it was very exciting. There's also dams that are supposed to be coming down on the Klamath River. I know of 4 that they're talking about removing. There's a lot of back and forth about this, but this has the potential, it's still in the future, but this still has the potential to restore wild salmon and steelhead runs. It's still, unfortunately, it's very unfortunate that a lot of our especially in California, our Pacific salmon are still in really, really bad shape. So there's a lot that still needs to be done. But I really think that the prospect of this naturally reproducing strain of native Pyramid Lake Lahontan cutthroats in the Truckee River is really a bright spot. Honestly, 40-pound plus fish migrating up a river out of the desert in numbers sufficient to support commercial fisheries for decades. This is one of the most amazing animals we had in Western North America, and we blew it with them, and we may have gotten a reprieve by the fact that somebody planted some at Pilot Peak, and then we had the good sense to go get them, and they're trying to rebuild this. So I think there's hope for these things, and I encourage you, even though they're not birds, to support your local native fish. And I'll stop there. Right.
Okay, Tom. Well, very nice to see you. and listen to you. And I found it fascinating, actually. Thank you very much. So bye-bye.
Thanks, Barry.
Bye, everybody.
We'll
Bye, Phil.
see
Bye-bye.
you at the Chautauqua, I hope.